Throughout history, philosophers, theologians, and numerous other thinkers have attempted to answer the question, where does truth come from? To some, truth can only be found by looking at the physical realm, while to others, one can only reach truth through an assiduous denial of the physical world. Despite the significant effort that philosophers have devoted to the subject of truth, many of the theories on truth's origin are based off of unfounded assumptions, from the existence of heaven to the motion of atoms. Because an investigation on truth studies the basis of man's ability to reason accurately, any assumptions that are not self-evident must be doubted as unreliable. One philosopher who rejected any unproven assumption in his theory on truth was René Descartes, who offered the strongest argumentation on truth's origin in his work, Discourse on the Method, by doubting all the notions he had previously held as true, and instead established his theory on the indubitable principle, I think, therefore I am. Despite the multiplicity of theories describing the nature and origin of truth, the most widely accepted definition of truth originated from Aristotle's Physics, where the philosopher defined truth as a knowledge of the causes and first principles that relate to the natural world. Common examples of these universal principles include geometric common notions and universal laws of physics. Hence, for clarity, this paper follows Aristotle's definition that truth is a knowledge of the universal principles that govern the behavior and identity of objects in the natural world. In his work, The Phaedrus, Socrates attempted to describe the origin of truth by positing that at the beginning of men's existence, their souls mounted ethereal chariots and rode with the gods in the heavenly realm. Each chariot was guided by a pair of horses, one of which was well-bred and virtuous, while the other was vicious and rebellious. As men's souls rode through the heavens, they eventually arrived at a steep ascent that led to, quote, the summit of the arch that supports the heavens. It is here that true being dwells, and all true knowledge is knowledge thereof, quote. While this climb proved easy for the gods, many human souls were unable to make the ascent, burdened and ultimately undermined by the steeds of wickedness. As these unfortunate souls plummeted from heaven, they were trapped inside physical bodies and separated from the wisdom and truths they had learned in heaven. From this framework, Socrates argued that while on earth, the only way for men to recover heavenly truth is through the soul's recollection of its previous existence. Socrates held that all earthly objects corresponded to transcendental forms, heavenly entities that define reality in the physical world by serving as the basis for objects' identities. For example, the reality, existence, and properties of a desk are defined by its form in heaven, and it is only through this that a desk is called and identified as a desk. Heavenly forms bear a similar relation to truth as a mirror does to light. Just as a mirror reflects light into the eyes of an observer, so also the heavenly forms reflect heavenly truth into the souls of men. However, as Socrates explained in the Phaedo, the ultimate obstacle humans must overcome in the pursuit of truth is their own physical bodies, which work to prevent the human soul from seeing the light of truth by entangling it in carnal needs and pleasures. Quote, it seems that so long as we are alive, we shall continue closest to knowledge if we avoid, as much as we can, contact and association with the body, end quote. Instead of being absorbed with bodily influences, Socrates believed that men should strive to recollect the truths they learned in heaven by applying themselves to philosophy and abstaining from bodily concupiscence. Hence, to Socrates, truth and the forms were one and the same, because the only way for men to comprehend truth in objects resided in the participation of those objects with forms in heaven. While Socrates' Phaedrus presented several good arguments on the nature of truth, it did not adequately describe truth's origin because it failed to account for the cause of change in objects. In order for a theory to accurately describe the origin of truth, it must be able to account for both the identification and the motion of objects. In his work, The Metaphysics, Aristotle pointed out that Socrates' theory of the forms fail to explain the reason why objects in the physical realm change. For example, Socrates said that the realities and properties of a chair are inherently determined by the chair's participation with its heavenly form. However, according to Socrates, the forms admit to no change because they are transcendental and incorporeal, which means that any changes experienced by the desk in size, shape, and substance are not accounted for by the forms and go unexplained by Socrates' theory of the forms. Quote, "Those who believe in the forms do not suppose either that the forms are the matter of sensible things or that they are the source of movement. For they say, these are causes rather of immobility and of being at rest." End quote. In order for Socrates' theory of the forms to suffice as a complete description of truth's origin, it must be able to explain the cause of change in objects. Thus, by failing to describe the reason why objects experience corporeal change, Socrates' theory of the forms proved to be an incomplete philosophy on the nature of truth. To gain a more complete understanding on the origin of truth, Aristotle argued that the basis of reality in the natural world is not derived from heavenly forms, but rather from a set of universal principles. Quote, "The principles of eternal things must be always most true, for they are not merely sometimes true, nor is there any cause of their being, but they themselves are the cause of the being of other things." End quote. Aristotle traced the existence of these eternal principles back to a first principle, a supreme being who created the universe and the laws that dictate its motion. To prove the existence of the supreme being, Aristotle noted that for every observed effect, there must exist a corresponding cause. For example, when one observes a clock, it is apparent that it was made by a clockmaker. Otherwise, it would have assembled itself, which defies the basic notion that an object cannot be the cause of its own existence. Hence, just as the work of the clockmaker is the cause of the clock's existence, so also there must be a cause for the universe's existence. Aristotle continued by arguing that there must be a supreme being that created the universe and set it in motion as a first cause. If that were not the case, then the universe would be governed by a never-ending chain of causes extending back through time ad infinitum, that is, infinitely without ever reaching a starting point. This causal chain for the universe cannot extend back in time forever, because if it did, then there would be no starting point to the universe at all, and its very existence would be in doubt. As Aristotle stated, quote, "But of series which are infinite in this way, all the parts down to that now present are all alike intermediates, so that if there is no first cause, there is no cause at all." End quote. Hence, because the causal chain of the universe cannot extend back in time ad infinitum, there must exist a supreme being who is the starting point of the universe's existence. Quote, "But evidently there is a first principle, and the cause of things are neither an infinite series nor infinitely various in kind, for neither can one thing proceed from another ad infinitum." End quote. Thus, using the theory of causation, Aristotle argued that truth is a set of universal laws that were created by a supreme being at the beginning of time. Now, despite the applicability of Aristotle's causation theory in explaining the origin of truth in the corporeal universe, Aristotle's analysis relied entirely on rational arguments and little material observation in coming to its conclusions. Thus, although Aristotle's theory was well-reasoned, it ignored one of the most effective ways to ascertain the origin and nature of truth in the physical realm, the observation of natural phenomena. To remedy this, the Roman philosopher Lucretius published his work on the nature of the universe, which developed a theory on truth that looked extensively to the physical world to explain the origin and nature of truth therein. Lucretius proposed the idea that the reality and existence of the universe does not depend on the action of a supreme creator, but rather is determined by the motion and collision of atoms. Lucretius argued that at the beginning of time, all the atoms of the universe were falling through space with velocities parallel to each other. At some point in this atomic rainstorm, atoms spontaneously swerve from their linear velocities and hit other atoms. This atomic collision sent multiple atoms directly into the paths of other atoms, and after a long quantity of time, the atoms were eventually able to collide and deflect off of each other in such a way that their motion turned from sporadic collisions into ordered patterns, which became physical objects. Lucretius argued for the free will of atoms by observing that men have free will, and that the only way for men to deviate from their natural dispositions would be if the atoms that compose them were able to do so. Quote, if the atoms never swerve, so as to originate some new movement that will snap the bonds of fate, what is the source of free will possessed by living things throughout the earth? What is the source of that willpower swerving from our course at no set time or place? End quote. According to Lucretius, all physical objects, including humans, are masses of differentiated atoms, moving in organized patterns. Although atoms' minute size and high speed make them invisible to the human eye individually, massive groups of them can be observed as objects and humans. Hence, the fact that people have free will means that the atoms that compose humans must be capable of some deviation from their natural state, which supports the idea of an atomic swerve. Hence, Lucretius' theory of truth held that all reality in the natural world could be determined from the collision and motion of atoms within the corporeal realm. The idea that truth can be completely derived from the motion of atoms became known as Epicureanism and quickly gained popularity because it allowed men to explain the causes of natural phenomena around them without having to resort to the idea of gods or any higher principle, like Socrates' forms. As stated by Lucretius, quote, the reason why all mortals are so gripped by fear is that they see all sorts of things happening on the earth and in the sky with no discernible cause, and these they attribute to the will of a god. When we see that nothing can be created out of nothing, we shall then have a clearer picture of the path ahead, how things are created and occasioned without the aid of gods, end quote. As a result of Epicureanism, the idea that the universe was created by an intelligent designer was deemed impossible because it necessitated the creation of corporeal substance from nothing. Quote, nothing is never created by divine power out of nothing. If things were made out of nothing, any species could spring from any source. Men could arise from the sea and scaly fish from the earth, end quote. According to Lucretius and other Epicureans, atoms themselves are eternal, as evidenced by the fact that the sum total of all matter in the universe is constant. Hence, with the assumption that atoms have an infinite lifespan, Lucretius concluded that the best explanation for the genesis and continuation of the universe is atomic motion. By attributing the creation and perpetuation of the universe to atomic motion interactions, Lucretius argued that truth is not determined by a supreme being, but rather by the patterned motions of atoms throughout the universe. Although Lucretius' theory of the atomic swerve had a substantial impact on early philosophical thought, its validity quickly faded upon the further development of modern science. The development of modern science was greatly influenced by Francis Bacon, who agreed with Aristotle that truth in the natural world is ultimately dictated by universal principles. Where Bacon disagreed with Aristotle was on the method through which truth could be ascertained. While Aristotle had championed logic as the primary tool to be employed in truth's discovery and examination, Bacon held that human reason is inherently uncertain and that the only reliable way to discover truth was through extensive scientific observation and the derivation of general principles from those observations. To Bacon, scientific discovery and a knowledge of truth were one and the same. In fact, the Latin word for science, scientia, literally means knowledge. To illustrate the pitfalls of using logic to derive universal truths, Bacon pointed out the fact that all of the logical arguments used by ancient philosophers were founded on terms and ideas which had no clearly established definitions. Quote, propositions consist of words. Words are symbols of notions. Therefore, if the notions themselves are confused, there can be no firmness in the superstructure, there is no soundness in our notions. Substance, quality, action, essence are not sound notions, end quote. To remedy the inherent instability of logical notions, Bacon argued that the universal principles of nature could be ascertained only through a rigorous observation of natural phenomena and the gradual derivation of scientific principles from those observations. While man's natural faculties of perception are limited, Bacon emphasized the utilization of scientific instruments as an indispensable aid to man's observation of the universe. Quote, "There are only two ways of searching into and discovering truth. The one flies from the senses to the most general axioms. The other derives axioms from the senses and particulars, rising by gradual ascent, so that it arrives at the most general axioms last of all. This is the true way," end quote. Thus, Bacon described the origin of truth in man as being determined by his scientific observation of the world around him. Only 17 years after Bacon published his theory, a severe flaw in his reasoning was exposed by the philosopher René Descartes. In 1637, Descartes published his Discourse on the Method, where he explained that all human perception, including scientific observation, was subject to a degree of error, as evidenced by the fact that even the most renowned philosophers disagreed on many fronts. Quote, "Regarding philosophy, I shall say only this. Considering how many diverse opinions learned men may maintain on a single question, even though it is impossible for more than one to be true, I held as well nigh false everything that was merely probable," end quote. This meant that Bacon's method for discovering universal maxims was not reliable insofar as it relied on subjective human perception. Thus, the purpose of Descartes' Discourse on the Method was to develop a completely undoubtable method for understanding truth that was free from any subjective components. Descartes began to develop his methodology by doubting everything he had previously held as indubitable, including logic, mathematics, perceptions, and his own existence. Quote, "Since I now wish to devote myself solely to the search for truth, I thought it necessary to reject as if absolutely false everything in which I can imagine the least doubt. Because our senses sometimes deceive us, I decided to suppose that nothing was such as they led us to imagine," end quote. As Descartes continued to doubt previously held maxims and perceptions, he realized that while he could doubt the veracity of virtually any proposition, the very act of his doubting directly indicated that he was thinking. After all, it would be impossible for him to doubt something without thinking. From this fundamental observation, Descartes formulated the maxim cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. This maxim helped Descartes realize that no matter how many things he doubted, he was incapable of ceasing to think. Hence, if something thinks, it must exist. Descartes inquired into the reason why such inherent certainty existed in the principle, I think, therefore I am. Since there was nothing in the statement itself that implied its veracity, Descartes concluded that the statement was true because he clearly and distinctly perceived its validity without relying on any preconceived assumptions. Thus, Descartes concluded that the starting point to discovering universal truths was the undoubtable principle, I think, therefore I am. Now, from the starting point, Descartes argued that truth is a set of universal laws and notions that God implants into the minds of men. While men must use reason to realize the truth of these universal maxims, God's will is what ultimately inculcates these principles in men. Quote, "I discovered certain laws that God has established in nature. He has implanted notions of these laws in our minds in such a way that after adequate reflection, we can't doubt that the laws are exactly observed in everything that exists or occurs in the world," end quote. Hence, Descartes agreed with Aristotle and Bacon that truth in the physical world is dictated by universal laws and principles. Where Descartes distinguished himself from the other philosophers was that while Socrates, Aristotle, Lucretius, and Bacon held that truth in the physical world is dictated by universal laws and principles, Descartes, I'm sorry, I did that wrong. Whereas Socrates, Aristotle, Lucretius, and Bacon held that truth can only be arrived at through experimentation and reasoning, Descartes contended that truth is ultimately given to men by God and not obtained as a result of man's efforts. To support his idea, Descartes noticed that the principle, I think, therefore I am, allowed him to go from a state of doubting to a state of absolute certainty. Since he could doubt his own existence, but could not doubt the truth of the principle, I think, therefore I am, it followed that his method allowed him to think of something more indubitable and thus more perfect than his own existence. Descartes could imagine that he did not exist. However, no matter how hard he tried, he could not convince himself that the principle, I think, therefore I am, was false, because the very act of thinking further verified the fact that he existed. Descartes marveled at the fact that he was capable of comprehending a principle more certain than his own existence. And he realized that since he himself was a finite and variable being, his ability to comprehend invariable and perfect truth must have originated from an external source, a being that was perfect in every respect and was the ultimate standard and source of truth. Descartes concluded that this being was God. Quote, I decided to inquire into the course of my ability to think of something more perfect than I was, and even possessing in itself all the perfections of which I could have any idea, that is God, end quote. Hence, Descartes concluded that because men are imperfect, and because they can conceive a principle more certain and perfect than themselves, there must be a supreme being who imbues those perfect thoughts into them. Using this reasoning, Descartes described truth as a set of universal principles that are revealed to men by God and whose truth is verified through reflection. The quest for truth is a noble endeavor that has drawn the attention and effort of many worthy philosophers. While Socrates, Aristotle, Lucretius, and Bacon all had good contributions to make to the quest for truth, their reasoning ultimately fell short because it relied on unfounded assumptions, from the existence of forms to the motion of atoms. Descartes' discourse on the method provided the strongest arguments on the origin and nature of truth because it started with no unsubstantiated presumptions, made conclusions that necessarily followed from the principle I think, therefore I am, and traced the origin of truth to the most perfect thing imaginable, God.
All right. I would like to begin by asking you to make a differentiation between how truth is found and what its nature is.
Yep.
For example, if I asked you what is milk and you told me at the grocery store, that would be definitely not the question I was wanting you to answer. So throughout a good portion of this paper, you have examined the question of how truth is found, the means by which it has come to. How is that question different from looking at what the nature of truth is?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think they are influential on each other, though. The purpose of my paper, though, is to basically delineate all the philosophers throughout history, what they thought truth was, and how they thought to get to truth. So the question, what is truth, is a relatively, I would say, a more simple, significantly more simple question than the question, how do we get to truth? And I think we see that throughout history. For the most part, Aristotle, Bacon, and Descartes, they agree technically on what truth is. Like, it's this set of universal principles, as I define it, that govern the identity and behavior of the natural world. So that's the question, what truth is. How do we get there, though, is a completely different, I would say even more complicated question that philosophers have come up with significantly more answers to that question. Like Descartes, for Descartes it was, I think therefore I am. For Aristotle it was logic. For Bacon it was scientific experiments. For Socrates it was the forms. So I think that they're obviously very different questions, and I was really trying to capture both in my paper. As I say in one of my last paragraphs, though, what really for the most part distinguishes Descartes or Aristotle or Bacon is largely their method for getting to truth, if that makes sense.
Okay, and can you say, well, your paper is titled The Quest for Truth.
Yes.
So my assumption is that the paper is primarily focusing on how it is obtained rather than its nature. But can you say more about just the connection between how one understands the quest for truth and how one views truth itself?
Okay, so you're talking about, again, the method for getting to truth versus what truth actually is. Well, again, I mean, is there a relationship between those two? I suppose you could say there is. If someone believes that truth is relative, for example, they would use a completely different method to get to truth, as, say, someone who believed that truth is objective. So, and I think we see this very clearly. To Lucretius, if you think about it, he's more of a, what we would say, a moral relativist, because to Lucretius, truth is dictated by the motion of atoms. That's very relative. So here's how I think it works, and this is obviously my opinion. It starts with the question, what is truth? You have to answer that question first. To Lucretius, the answer was atomic motion. To Aristotle and Bacon, the answer was universal principles. Once you answer that question, though, you need to answer the second question, how do I get there? So the relationship, I would say, is a relationship of a first to a second, a prior to a secondary. So and really there is not a whole, within my paper, there's not a whole lot of conflict between what is truth. Most of the conflict is, again, in the methodology. But I would say you need to answer the question, what is truth, before you can talk about a methodology. So the relationship, to answer your question, is one of a prior relationship versus a secondary one.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Cochrane. I'd like to go next to the last sentence. In your second paragraph, you say, hence for clarity, this paper follows Aristotle's definition that truth is a knowledge of the universal principles that govern the behavior and identity of objects in the natural world. Now, that definition in itself seems highly restrictive, as there are many elements that we speak of as being true, such as mathematical formulae, that are not existing in the natural world. And the fact that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 is also not a truth that is part of the natural world. It exists outside of the natural world as a universal. And so you started, why did you choose Aristotle's definition of truth when in fact so much of what we're interested about the nature of truth, what is beauty, what is goodness, what is justice, are not elements of the natural world?
Right, that is a great question, and 2 points. The first is that on your thing of mathematics, I would say technically mathematics is included under that insofar as it applies to science. Like I say also in my second paragraph, common examples of these principles include geometric common notions and universal laws of physics. So I'm referring, I believe those do fit under my definition, because you're correct. 2 plus 2 equals 4, you can't like find that anywhere, but it is directly applicable to the physical world. Like if 2 plus 2 equals 5, then a lot of things that we see in the physical world today would be different. So that's the point about mathematics. Now, why do I restrict the definition? Is because when I was making this paper, in my mind there are 2 basically facets of truth. There's the scientific facet, which is what I'm dealing with here. The other facet is, like you said, I see it as more of a theological facet. The whole idea of, understanding God and understanding absolutes like beauty and all that sort of thing. In my mind, though, it is more productive to start with what we can see around us, to start with the natural world, because that is what God has given us, in my opinion, to directly observe. And using that, we come to conclusions about God. But I think that when we start with a huge question, like, what is the nature of beauty? That's a huge question. And I think one of the more effective ways to go about answering that question in the long run is to not pounce on the question directly, to go more of a indirect route, using the material observations that we can gain from the natural realm to kind of cross over. Because I do discuss God in my paper, but you'll notice I don't do it in a theological format. I don't do it like most theologians would do it. And the reason why is because I think it's just a more effective way of tackling the question, given the fact that we as humans have limited perception and limited capabilities.
Are you arguing that the realm within which we best understand truth is the realm of our senses, and that world and the observation of the physical world around us is the realm within which we can most accurately understand the nature of truth?
Not necessarily. I think it's the first and maybe even the primary, but I'm not saying that's the only one. Like, I'm not going to say that's kind of a very Bacon-like position. The whole thing about all you can know is scientific experimentation. I'm not taking that position. But what I am saying is that this paper is more of a precursor to answering larger questions than it is because, you know, we were given reason and senses, you know, for a reason. They're not an end in of themselves. The ultimate goal of those is to answer larger questions. But my contention is that we can't do that until it's a prerequisite issue, basically. So the prerequisite is understanding the natural world, the laws of physics, and then we can go to understand further questions about theology and God and the nature and beauty, etc.
Yeah, Immanuel Kant makes the position that the understanding of God and understanding of the natural world about us could be radically differentiated. That the rules of logic that we might learn by looking at the natural world around us would perhaps be very different and applied to the theological realm. There's a very strong divide between, as we call it, the noumenal and the phenomenal. Now, Thomas Aquinas seems to assume that there's a continuity between them. And you, by finishing your paper, by holding to Descartes' position regarding truth, particularly things in the natural world, where are you going to, or how would you draw that divide between the way logic and the mind is used to define truth in the natural world, and how those would be applied in going beyond the things that are unseen?
That's an interesting question. So on the topic of Kant, what's interesting is that I think it's in the very last chapter on, you know, the big questions and the questions of God. You are correct in saying that he does say you have the world of perception, you have the world outside perception, and the world outside perception is kind of, you know, we don't really know a lot. But what he does say is that we know certain causalities that exist inside of the corporeal realm. So inside of the earth, we know laws of physics, we know laws of mathematics. But here's the key connection. The key connection, he goes on to say, the reason why those laws are true is because of God. So can we look outside of our limited scope of perception and start looking at God? No, we as humans are finite, and I think we can all agree to that. So to me, the most effective way to observe a infinite, otherwise I would say unknowable being is through the observation of the corporeal realm. And that's exactly what Kant says. So in terms of the distinction, I think that's the distinction Kant makes, and that's the distinction I agree with. In terms of Aquinas, I would disagree with his actual methodology, as organized and as good as it was. You know, as humans, my personal belief is that we have a very difficult time even thinking about God, even thinking about the concept of infinity or the concept of spacelessness. I mean, these are things that we just don't have the capacity to understand. So I think in terms of the distinction, I would actually be more inclined to go with Kant than I would be Aquinas, which is kind of odd, but that's what I would say.
One last question. I'd just like to challenge your assumption that we seem to begin by using reason and applying our minds to the physical world.
Yes.
I mean, you don't have to teach Sunday school very long until you see little kids that will just go into all sorts of realms of the abstract. Questions like, that was not fair, you're not a kind person, or as I have a 4-year-old, very dear to me, who oftentimes says, Daddy, I love you, but I love God more. And these sort of, you know, just very abstract ideas. And living in the realm of the abstract appears to come very early to us. And the world of the physical, sometimes I wonder if it's a learned habit to think of the world of the physical as more certain. Whereas even Plato says the world of the physical is changing and inconstant and not an object of true thought. So could you please argue why you think the realm of the physical somehow is more basic to us or more inherent to our mental ability?
Well, to me, it's pretty simple. I mean, now, I want to make a distinction. Do we think of abstract things? Yes. I'm not arguing that we don't think of abstract things. My argument is very simple, that we have A, perceptions, and B, reason. Those two things are, in my opinion, the primary modes of understanding truth that we are given by God. And those find brilliant applications in the physical realm. I think that's where they have their most effective applications. Now, can we think of abstract things? Yes, but you'll notice, it's kind of curious, you can't come up with a completely original thought. Like, you can't think of something that you've never seen, touched, felt, tasted, etc. So yes, it is true, we do think of abstract things, but I would argue that that abstraction is an amalgamation of what we know from what we've perceived or what we've reasoned about the world. Because, again, I can't think of, using the famous example of like a square circle, okay? From my own scientific experience, from my reading of Euclid's Elements, I know that that's false. So I can't if I make a new thought, it's not really new, you see. It's an amalgamation of what I've already perceived or what I've already reasoned through. So to me, that means that the physical observation of universal laws and etc., that would be the prior question.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Sorry. You may not be able to answer this question because it's not something you necessarily cover in
Okay.
But I was just wondering, can you say anything about how Hume fits in? Like, have you thought at all about how he fits in?
In terms of, you're talking like, yes, that's actually...
Like, his criticism of Bacon.
Yeah, I mean...
Or like his method.
Well, to me, Hume and Bacon were very materialistic, like experimental. And this is kind of odd, the specific criticism I brought against that was from Descartes. Descartes basically said that any human experimentation is subject to a degree of error. And the idea behind that is, we're talking about the nature of truth. So there really isn't any room for error under this discussion. So, I was thinking in geometry, if Euclid got one of his propositions wrong, that'd be pretty bad. But that doesn't mean reason doesn't exist anymore. If we're approaching the question of truth and we do something wrong, that completely messes everything up. So I don't think this addresses the specific criticism, but to me, I see Bacon and Hume as actually somewhat similar in that they're both very pragmatic, if you understand, very experimental, which is good. I think there should be a balance between that, but like Lucretius, that's all he used, and look where that got him. So that's kind of how I would actually address Bacon and Hume as being kind of similar in that regard. Because to me, you have the classic, you have Aristotle over here, with like only reason, that's all we're using. And you have the other extreme over here, you have pure scientific experiments. That's where I see Hume and Bacon. Descartes is a unique mixture, if you will, of the two, because he is dealing with the real world. It may not seem like he's a guy who locks himself in a cabin somewhere. So it's like, how is he dealing with the real world? Well, he's going off of a principle, and it's so brilliant. He's going off of a principle that if you doubt it, it verifies its own truth. He's saying, because the whole thing, when I said the whole thing, I think, therefore I am, if you doubt that principle, you're further verifying its truth. Because if you're doubting, you're thinking, and you have to, obviously exist if you're thinking. So that probably answers your question, and I'll plus a little more, if that makes sense. Okay, good. Yes?
Sorry. If anyone else wants to go, feel free. But how, I'll see if I can tie two thoughts together. How is what Descartes does after I think, therefore I am, like reasoning up to God?
Yes.
How is that different from I kind of think that is logic.
Yes.
How is that distinct from Aristotle? And also, this might be a second, and if you get to it maybe. What about people who don't, like Descartes doesn't have a ton of, it doesn't do much for me in terms of like, oh, this really makes me
That's
believe
true.
you.
Yeah.
What do you do in that about truth? Like, does that mean I can't access truth?
Okay,
So, yeah.
okay. So on the concept of Aristotle, so yes, you're correct. They both use logic. In my mind, though, Aristotle used just purely reason alone, and Descartes does use reason, but it's reason that as it relates to corporeal existence. And there was the criticism brought against Aristotle, against that Lucretius provided, that he wasn't really grounded in the real world. And Socrates and Aristotle, very different characters. Existed, Aristotle was kind of Socrates' successor, in a way. They did both rely extensively on reason. And I'm not saying Descartes doesn't, but the degree, to me, it's a separation almost from the real world that you have in Aristotle versus Descartes. Yes, he does reason, but he does reason in very pragmatic terms, if that makes sense. Your question about, so what was your second question?
What about people who know that kind of a truthful statement, like I think that I am, what if that doesn't do anything for you? Like,
okay.
How do you access truth if the reasonable arguments don't work on you?
If they don't work on you, I think
that's really vague.
I think that would be unfortunate if they didn't work. But I mean,
I guess like my lost cause is Descartes doesn't help me.
Okay, so Descartes doesn't help you. Yes. Now I like to make this very clear. This isn't a rather esoteric discussion, so you don't walk up to someone on the street and start like that's just not how it works. A lot of people, to be very frank, a lot of people just don't give this area much thought. This is like metaphysics. This is, Mr. Rich was talking about Immanuel Kant. This is kind of like Immanuel Kant. Like, people don't see this as a necessary part of their lives. Here's my view of this, and here's where I think its use is. If you want a method of truth that does not rely on any preconceived assumptions. And here's what I would say. This also addresses your question of Aristotle. Here's, I think, another differentiation. Socrates and Aristotle, they did assume a lot of things. Like, we believe in the existence of heaven. But if you're doing a quest for truth, if you're doing a theory on the origin of truth, you cannot afford to make any preconceived notions that are not substantiated. And in my mind, Aristotle and Socrates did not give any proof for a lot of the assumptions that they made. So it's like Euclid making common notion 1 without it being a self-evident statement. So to me, heaven's existence is not necessarily a self-evident statement. So Aristotle and Socrates made those assumptions. The difference between them and Descartes is that Descartes did. Descartes' one assumption is the brilliant statement that if you doubt it, it comes back. It's something, if you doubt it, it verifies itself. It is a self-evident or self-verifying principle. So the distinction, very simply, is, in my mind, Descartes is way more founded than they are when it comes to common notions. And yes, of course, it is a philosophical, esoteric discussion. But the reason why Descartes made his work, as I explained in my paper, is for people who really want a undoubtable reason for why they believe what they believe. And I think that is, I do believe to an extent that's useful. So that was a long discussion. Yes.
All right, let me try to formulate this. So Descartes tries to build this method that's just not built on all these kind of assumptions that the other philosophers have been making, which, seems to be a good idea since we don't necessarily know for certain if these assumptions are true. However, in order to formulate this idea, he does have to have some kind of definition that, say, thinking beings exist.
Yes.
Are definitions different from assumptions? Are they not built with assumptions? How does that work?
That's a good question. I would say that yes, he does make that. I would actually call that an assumption. So whether or not you want to call it a definition or assumption, to me, doesn't make that much of a difference. Yes, it is an assumption, but as I was discussing earlier, it is a self-evident assumption. And just like things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other, that's a self-evident assumption. The existence of heaven, the existence of atoms, an atom randomly swerving and going, hey, I'm going to start the universe, not so much. That, to me, the purpose of this paper is to clearly show that, yes, of course, you must make assumptions. The question is, of all the theories we have, which one is the most solid with the least number of unfounded assumptions? And to me, it's very clear that Descartes warrants the ballot on that, in my mind. If that makes sense.
Yes. So
okay.
Just to be perfectly clear, we're distinguishing between like the assumptions that the common notions are, where it really is you can't contradict it, and then
think of it like a postulate. It's like like common notion 1 versus like the whole postulate about you drawing lines and even though that is more self-evident. Like, actually, anything within geometry is kind of self-evident anyway, so that's not fair. Think of it as combination 1 versus like presuming that the moon exists without ever having any proof of it, or assuming that heaven exists, or anything like that. I think that's the differentiation there. Yes?
I would like to bring up another philosopher, and
okay.
Your paper really approached truth in a very scientific way, and this guy actually talked about it in theological ways as much as theologian. He could be Nietzsche.
Yes.
He said, "What if truth were a woman?" So, what do you have to say about that? Is my first question.
What position?
What if truth were a woman?
Okay. I mean, to me, that's a very. I understand where you're going with that. It's approaching truth in my mind in I would say it's an erroneous manner. Truth, to me, is a set of universal principles. This whole personification of truth, and again, I don't know what substantiation he has for that or what analysis he has behind, but first of all, in the context of my paper, I'm talking about like physical truth, like truth in the natural world and how that relates to God. So my response to that would be it promotes an idea of truth that misleads humans, because it's very easy for us to think that we've arrived at truth. It's very easy for us to form notions of truth that may be completely wrong, but we're convinced of them, so they must be right. We see that a lot in a lot of philosophers, and I think that's a pitfall in human reason. It's a sort of, think of it as an overconfidence. I think that would be an accurate description, because the starting ground is almost more important in this discussion, this paper specifically. The starting ground is almost more important than the destination, because if you're starting with, like I'm sure Nietzsche had his set of assumptions that he made that are completely unsubstantiated. That promotes, in my opinion, a methodology that is unreliable and ineffective when it comes to pursuing truth. That'd be like doing Euclidean geometry and assuming a lot of stuff. So, yes.
But wouldn't you say Christ could be somewhat of a personification of truth?
Yes, that is absolutely correct, and that is why this paper does not deal with theological truth. So there's a reason why I have Aristotle's definition. But yes. Here's what I would say to Christ. Christ is obviously an exception that everyone likes to talk about. But how? It's true. It's kind of true. But let's talk about how we can know God in general, though. Yes, we can look at the life of Christ and we can glean a lot of stuff with him. But when he's gone, when he's not here, to me, Descartes is the way to go. It's the understanding the physical world around us first and using that as a stepping point to then understanding God better, more in general. So if that answers your question. Okay. Yes, Ms. Perry.
I had a question about your definition of truth from the beginning,
okay.
about a knowledge of the universal principles that govern the behavior and identity of objects in the natural world.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering why you use the word knowledge, because it seems like knowledge is something that has to do with the seeker of truth, like the assumption of truth.
Okay.
I was just wondering why you use that.
Why I use knowledge
definition
specifically?
of truth. Yeah.
As opposed, you're saying like
a set of principles.
like you're talking about knowledge. So what would be the substitution you're suggesting here? Like a knowledge versus just truth?
I guess I wonder why you didn't just say truth is just a set of universal principles, not knowing universal principles.
Okay, that's true. Yeah, that's a good question. It's from the perspective of a human.
Okay.
So it's like attaining, technically, maybe more I could say attaining truth is a knowledge of it. But yes, I'm not saying truth. I mean, from a human perspective, it is a knowledge, though. It's a certainty. It's a, because when we say we've reached truth, we can't and this is getting really weird, but we can't take the principles and put them in our minds. I have truth right here with me. You can know it. So yes, I would say the reason why I put that is because we're talking about this paper in the context of a human, and in the context of a human, to have truth is to know it. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, good. Oh yes.
More questions.
More questions. Good.
Whenever you were answering Melissa's question, you said whenever Christ is gone, Descartes is the way to go.
I would, yes.
And there's one quote in his book that talks about how reason in man is whole and complete.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any point at which that breaks down?
Now, you're saying, do I agree that reason is complete in the sense that it's infallible?
Yes.
Or no?
That's what.
No, and that seems contradictory to what he's doing here, because I'd have to, so to answer your question more effectively, I'd have to know what exactly he meant by reason, because if he's talking about like conventional reason, that's definitely not true. Like, because when he made his theory, he rejected all of the stuff that reason had put in place. So I think when he's referring to reason, he's referring to the perfect reason based off the principle, I think, therefore I am. You have that principle and you reason up from there. I think that's what he's referring to. And would I agree that that is whole and true? I would. For two reasons. The first, because it starts with the right assumption. It starts with, as we discussed earlier, no preconceived notions. And second of all, as I also say, it only makes conclusions that necessarily follow from the previous logical steps. So we're not saying like the sky is blue, therefore God exists. We're not doing any of that. It's just perfectly logical steps. So yes, let's say yes. Yes.
I'm going to bring up Descartes' I think before I am. Again, when he says that, it pops out to me that, well, humans are real, obviously. So, and he thinks what he says is true because he's real. So, I think my question is there a difference between something being true and something being real?
Is there a difference between something being true and something being real?
Yes.
You could argue that. I mean, you could say, like we were discussing earlier, the whole concept of mathematics. It's true, but does it can you touch it in the physical realm? No. Is that what you're, or is it kind of different distinction you're going for?
Maybe a little bit, but more along the lines of, we could say that a unicorn says, I think therefore I am.
Right.
But that does not mean that a unicorn is real.
For sure. For sure.
So,
and that's actually a very interesting point. This is kind of odd, but using Descartes, and for some people this is a criticism, so just be warned. For Descartes, the principle I think therefore I am, it does apply to you, but you really, from that principle, you can't be 100, from that principle alone, you can't be sure that other people exist, because you can't go into their minds and say, you can't do that. There is a way to be certain that other people exist, but it doesn't involve that principle in isolation. You have to build up from there and make arguments from that. You can't use that in isolation.
So for it to be true,
to the individual, that answers your question. Truth versus reality. Okay.
I can make a closing comment on a slightly lighter note for those that may not be convinced about Descartes. I think you've used Descartes as the center of your paper. I think therefore I am. I would offer an empiric observation. I went on a backpacking trip with Jared and his best friend, and we didn't take a bath for a week. And we drove home together in a car, and I thought to myself, I stink, therefore I am. And if there's any doubt left remaining after all of your thinking, that will solve it for you.
Thank you very much. Cochrane. All right, thank you very much. All right, take a short break. We'll get started with the next paper. Hello, Miss Pruitt.